Our first speaker for the evening is Sean Blagsvedt, CEO of a social enterprise called babajob.com. By connecting employers to informal sector employees, Sean is empowering the developing world through social networking. Previously, Sean spent 9 years with Microsoft in the Office, Windows, and research groups. In 2004, Sean moved to Bangalore as a third member of Microsoft Research India, heading the program management and advanced prototyping team. This allowed him to focus on novel approaches to mobile phones and technology in emerging markets. It's my pleasure to introduce Sean.
Hello. Hi, my name's Sean Blagsvedt, and I hope I'll talk about something interesting today. So what I want to talk about is really about trust and evolution, and how those things are connected, and where this all may be going with a bunch of technology going forward. And so one of the things that I like to do is, when you think about the future, to also think about the past, because I think that often informs where we're going. And one of my favorite books on this subject is by a fellow named Robert Wright, and he's written several of my favorite books. But this one in particular is called Non-Zero. And what it's really about is, what's the logic behind evolution? What's pushing us? What's pushing literally organic chemistry all the way up to the WTO? And his basic thesis is non-zero sum interactions, right? And so you're like, well, what the hell does that mean? And I think it's best summed up by an example, right? This is a classic picture of David and Goliath. This is what we call a zero-sum interaction. One guy wins, other guy loses. Now what's interesting is, if this little fellow gets 4 of his friends together, suddenly the relationship he has with those 4 friends, or in this case 3 friends, is non-zero sum. Namely, if they all work together, they can beat Goliath and they all win. Whereas if they all work together and fail, they all lose. And so basically, what's this really about? And so, in the simplest ways, it's cooperate so we both win. And so clearly this happens in war. But it also happens in things like trade. I give you money, I'm doing so consensually, you give me a product, right? We both win. We're both choosing to do this. And it also happens around specialization, right? Adam Smith and others talked about this a bunch. To say, if I get really good at building software websites, other people can pay me to do it. And this logic of let's get together and let's bond together to basically work against other threats that we see around you, the thesis of this book is this is what drove single-cellular organisms to multicellular organisms, to then getting larger, to the first set of humans really working together, to then bound into small towns and villages, and then get bigger as they basically needed to be able to trade, have trade routes, and importantly, had war with the other folks around them in order to protect themselves. And so on, to get to larger units, right? And so just to summarize, these are win-win interactions. These are things where you and I are working together, we're binding our fates together. And in order to do that, trade really helps with this. In order to do trade, I have to trust you. If I'm going to make a contract with you, I want you to know that you're going to pay me in the future. I want to be able to verify that. In the famous words of Reagan, trust but verify, it's very much about this. And what I get is I get security, right? So you and I, if we're 2 cities and we're working together, suddenly we're not going to fight together. But what I give up is very important too. Namely, I give up freedom. Mumbai can't independently decide that it wants to attack a neighboring city without basically getting sign-off of the whole country, just as my cells can't sort of independently decide that they're going to do something different than the rest of my body. And so we basically bind our freedom to our collective action together. And additionally, we also give up privacy. If I want to take a flight, in order to basically ensure that I'm trusted enough to board that plane, I give up the ability to have private things in my bags, right? So where's this go in the long run? And so basically, if the history of humanity is any indication, we keep getting bigger political units. And this seems to be driven by our interdependence, by threats, and by things like terrorism. And I'll give you an example from the past that I think is telling. You're like, what are terrorists from the past? They're pirates. And so if you want to look at how Italy became Italy and not Troy or Venice or Sparta, a lot of it actually has to do with pirates. And pirates would essentially attack one naval city, pillage, and then take off and go and attack another one. And so essentially the city-states of Italy got together and they said, listen, what we need in order to fight this threat is a unified navy. Well, in order to have a unified navy, you need one commander. And then you have to solve the problem of how do you choose who that commander is? And the answer to that was, well, we should form a nation, and then we can collectively say who's the commander of that nation. And this process obviously continues today, where we continue to face terrorist threats, and governments, in the interest of our safety, quite reasonably, take actions that have consequences for things like our privacy and freedom. And so 9/11 happened and the US Patriot Act came out, which authorized the government to do all sorts of things that have been in the news lately around surveillance. And India had a similar moment in 2008 with the Mumbai attacks, and its reaction was in some ways not dissimilar, that it formed and funded NatGrid, which is a large computer surveillance system, again, with very similar goals of things like the NSA, of being able to say, hey, is somebody talking about a terrorist bombing right now? Now, what's interesting is when these technologies sort of begin to get together, and when I first saw this, I thought it was a real revelation, but lately in the news, it's less, is one of the ways that the Mumbai terrorists got caught is they made telephone calls from the bay outside of Mumbai to Pakistan, and it was the NSA that knew about these calls and knew the location of those things. And so this is one of the things that sort of boggles my mind, is for everyone in this room with a cell phone in their pocket, somehow the US government knows where you are. Right? And that's just the nature of the world that we're in right now, and that's unnerving in one sense, but seems to be reality. And if you go back to what I was talking about earlier, may even be inevitable. And so clearly there are fears, right? If you look at the states in the world with the strongest piracy or privacy laws, those are the ones with some of the worst abuses in their past. And so I worry, that if you look at privacy laws in Germany and compare them to India or the U.S., they're certainly not as strong here. And then furthermore, there's this piece of, if you look at the surveillance quotes that come out of the people that are building NatGrid and other things, I think they quite reasonably want to empower local cops. But I don't know, at a sort of fundamental level, are we all comfortable with that? And this is many of the issues that Snowden has brought up. And in my own company, we've sort of experienced this of, there was a fellow that was accused of theft, and so we basically set up kind of a sham interview so that the cops could meet with him and question him. And he was late. He was supposed to be there at 10:30. And so we said, and the cops then asked, what's his mobile number? And we said, oh, okay, this is the mobile number. And 10 minutes later, and this was just a beat cop in Bangalore, he was able to tell us the location of this fellow in real time. And there was no clear process, right? There was no warrant that got signed or anything like that. It's just that this data is there and is certainly available, right, if you have the right access today. And so the question I've thought about a lot, is where does it end? And this is a really scary thing, but I think we have to sort of reckon with it. That as the terrorists get better at doing what they do, and God forbid, bomb a major city, we will react and say, listen, if technology could have been used or could be used in the future to prevent those things, we'll give up this freedom, we'll give up this privacy, just as we always have, just as evolution has always dictated, in order to basically have this security back. And so, you then think, well, where does that really go? That means that probably governments are going to share all this data, probably that anything that we do electronically has zero privacy associated with it, and that every interaction may, require verification or trigger an alert somewhere if it seems anomalous. And so this is sort of a scary scenario. And so, as a technologist, what's the bright side in all this? And I really think there are, and I don't actually think these get highlighted enough. So one, what does it mean for you to have trust and openness in your life as a normal person? And one of the things that I think about a lot is we all want people around us to simply do what they said they were going to publicly do, right? So if you take an auto and you say this is the meter, you end up getting really angry if that's not the meter at the end of that ride. If you write a contract with somebody and they don't come through on that contract, you get angry that, oh, I couldn't do this and I couldn't rely on things. And this is frustrating, and I'll argue this actually impedes productivity and all of us sort of reaching our own potential. And so from a tech perspective, the thing I think about is companies that do really well of just doing what they promise they're going to do tend to do really well themselves. So you take an example of one of the best modern Indian websites, right? What does it do? It offers pretty good prices, it's legitimate, and it delivers stuff in 2 days, right? So you can rely on that. The part that's more interesting is when those companies basically say, hey, everyone in my system, and I've created a system in such a way that they're all going to do what they promise to do. And this is a really powerful idea. And I'll give you some examples. So I don't know if any of you have tried out Uber yet. Uber's expensive, but great, right? You get in the car, they come, you ping them on the phone, there's a meter, and you get off. And there's a rating system, so you never have a bad driver experience with Uber. And if you do, as I once had, you get $200 back. It was great. You have things also like Zomato that I think are actually very important. And the reason that they're important is suddenly, these are the worst restaurants in Mumbai, right? And so this is an interesting thing. So suddenly, we have all shared via a greater amount of openness and trust that these guys should be avoided. Similarly, I've always loved TripAdvisor because basically any place that you go, literally a vacation spot in the world, you can see what hundreds of other people thought about it, right? And you can make a really informed decision about that. And so, I'll get back to why is this good? This is good because people have more choices, right? And we make better ones. And that's an important thing because when people make bad choices, the bad guys win, right? And so you really want to create systems such that quality businesses and people that are legitimate make the most money, right? That continue to, do the best, right? And so this is a good thing. And I'll get on this, piece of it allows us to rely on each other. It allows us to assume that you're going to do what you're going to say you're going to do publicly. And I can go on with things, right? I don't have to worry about that. And if we can create more of that trust, this is a very powerful thing. And I think this is sort of illustrated by the converse of where we lack it. So, this school aside, in schools, you can imagine for most people, they don't have good data today in India on if I make 10,000 rupees a month and I need to spend 2,000 rupees a month on my kids' education, and I want to send them to an English medium school or a Hindi medium school within 2 kilometers of my house, which is the highest rated one, right? There's no site that gives you this data. Or similarly, if you've got a kid going to medical school and that guy asks for a donation, you're like, what do I get? What do the other students get? And this really is not a transparent, open, or trusted system at this point. Clearly, this is also true in real estate, right? In terms of, is title clear? Is this the best value for buck? And so I think there's some real opportunities here for tech or other systems to come along and create these levels of trust. And there's certainly some really exciting attempts to go ahead and tackle some of these problems. Like one of the things is I sometimes describe the state of Indian bureaucracy as a set of lower-level bureaucrats, some of whom may be corrupt, working against really well-meaning IAS officers who basically end up creating websites to try to institutionalize the de-empowering of those local-level bureaucrats. So you can go online and get your tax receipts, get your land records, and basically try to make them follow the rules. And they're basically trying to take advantage of this short amount of time that they have to institutionalize via technology a more trusting system. And that's good, right? And then obviously for me, right, the thing that we were working on at Baba Job is about trying to solve the employment problem and creating more of this trust and openness in the informal sector. And there are some very basic problems that everybody has of, if I'm a job seeker, what's the best job for me? How much should I be paid? What am I really worth? This is not data that's known to a guy with a 5th grade education and thinks about being a security guard. And similarly on the employer side, there's constantly this question of, how much should I pay? How do I know that the candidate that I want to hire isn't lying on his resume? What do I do if that person steals from me? What recourse do I have? These are all perfectly valid questions and the sort of things that happen when you don't have trust in a system. And so what we're trying to do is to say, okay, there's clearly this divide, and how can we try to make that better? And we were originally inspired by this piece of, if you think about 2 nannies, they'll often make radically different amounts of money. And the question is, why do they make radically different amounts of money? And traditionally, a lot of it's been on who you know, right? If you're born in the slum and you only have friends in the slum, then those are usually the places where you get jobs. But if you know somebody on the outside that can connect you to, the guy that owns the auto rickshaw stand, or some rich family that also needs somebody to help out, suddenly your access gets a lot better. And so again, the things that, why do some people get better jobs than others? It has to do with, at a very fundamental level, their social networks essentially gave them the access to hear about those better jobs, and also gave them the trust network so they could go and get an interview. And this has been work that came out of Duke, and the World Bank has sort of pushed very similar things, that the social networks really matter. And they really limit the choices people have. And so what are we trying to do? We're trying to say, listen, we think we can flatten that. We think we can say, listen, through a variety of interfaces of call centers and voice and websites, that we can say, I'll tell you about the jobs that are good for you, and I'll also try to assess the skills that you have. So when you contend that you can do, that you know the routes of Mumbai, you can actually prove it. And in terms of the impact that we've did, the thing that we're really trying to do, I'd say from a social perspective, is to say, how do we create freedom of choice in the livelihood space? We've made some progress. Of the people that are hired, earn about 20% more. And we've got, approaching 2 million job seekers, actually. But the part that's interesting is what's happening in terms of the economics here, too. So we were mapping, what are people just offering in the BPO and driver categories against inflation in India over the last 2 years? And what's interesting is, the red line here is the BPO, which has clearly gone up a lot. Inflation and CPI has gone up about 19% and 17% respectively, right? But even if you look at things like, what are the domestic live-in salaries in Mumbai, we've seen a 97% rise in just terms of the offered salaries. This isn't even what people are negotiating after the fact. Offered salaries for essentially English domestics have gone up almost 100% in the last 2 years. And for the non-English, they've even gone up 50%. You look at the e-commerce boom that's happened in India, and that's created all this demand so that, all those delivery guys now are actually making 30% more than they did 6 months ago. So one of the things that's changing, though, that has to do with, how technology, I think, is really going to change India dramatically in the next 10 years is UID. And why is UID interesting, right? This is the Unique Identification Program, or Aadhaar. Just out of a show of hands, how many of you have an Aadhaar number in this room? Not bad. So we're at about 600 million right now. And what's interesting is, I think, if you go back for the past, it's modeled a little bit on a program that with very similar goals that FDR started in the States in 1935, that was the Social Security Administration. And what this was trying to do is very similar to UID. It was distribute money to old folks to prevent poverty in the elderly. And in order to do that, you had to give everybody a unique number because you didn't want to double pay anybody. And so everybody got a number. And so, this started in 1935. And what's interesting is actually the secondary industries that took advantage of this new trust system that could be created. So out of this Social Security number, suddenly you get the rise of credit agencies like Equifax and credit cards. And that then led to things that were really interesting, like digital money, because I could basically swipe a card, and I knew that if I didn't pay back that credit card, my credit rating would be hurt. And so what's interesting to me is this is why we have Google. Right? If you go back to 1996, 1997, what's their business model? It's that somebody can go up to a website, click on a thing that says flowers, and if they click, they're likely to pay that online. And then this led to weird things like free email. And then this led to weird things like Google getting into the mobile phone space and basically distributing a free operating system so that the whole world has cheap phones. And my point here is, I don't think FDR would have ever predicted that this many industries might come out of essentially a better trust system, that new businesses and fields could be created out of that. And so, one of the things I think about too is Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for basically doing a workaround for the fact that poor women can't bet on their future earnings. And with UID, you suddenly can. I was talking to an insurance executive, and if you give him a UID number, he'll give you a 70% better return on your life insurance policy, no questions asked, because he doesn't have any fraud problems. And so if you look at how we use it, right, and you'll see us rolling these things out in the next couple months, we're asking job seekers for that UID, but you see how this changes the relationship between employers and job seekers. Namely, if something goes wrong, you as an employer have real recourse. the entire system of government schemes and benefits are in a sense put at risk if this person steals from you, and vice versa. If the job seeker reports your UID, that has real meaning if you ever want to have another interaction with a police officer. And so my hope is, and my prediction is, this really will create more trust in this system, and that's going to be better for everybody. So finally, I'll leave you with, I think we're going to this bigger, more digitally connected, interdependent, trusting world, and I don't think we would want it any other way. Thank you.